My name's Eric Edmund, and I'm an MEP candidate on the Southwest Counties list. I live in Yeovil with my wife Mary, who's a paediatrician at the local hospital, and our children are all away at universities. Thank goodness. Previous to that, I worked for the Bank of England as the markets mathematician and also involved with monetary policy, briefing the MPC for 5 years. Before that, I was a university lecturer, and before that, I actually worked for the British government when Edward Heath took us into Europe, so I did see from the inside track what exactly went on and what lies were told and what was withheld from the British public during those negotiations. Now, being a university lecturer makes you very blasé about talking about things, and I really didn't know what I was going to talk about today, which is Friday the 13th, an inauspicious day, when Marilyn and Alan came round to film this. But I picked up the paper and I found this interesting headline in the Telegraph: Darling is braced for European pounding. Now, this refers to a meeting of the EU finance ministers, and they are not happy with Mr. Darling. And the reason they are not happy with Mr. Darling is simply because he's letting sterling float downwards against the euro. This is making, of course, euro exports to the UK much more expensive, and it's making British exports to the EU much less expensive. And they are not at all happy about this. But this arises, of course, because in fact our currency is the only sovereign item that we still have control over. And it is a jolly good thing, because that will enable us to come out of this recession much more quickly than the European economies. So poor Mr. Darling, he gets it in the neck both ways, but I have no real sympathy for him. The Germans and the French have a huge car industry. They are very, very exercised about the employment, and Sarkozy has been reported as saying he will put money into the French car industry, but it has to be spent in France. Now, if you compare that with our government, which puts money in but then doesn't impose these restrictions are of course contrary to EU competition law, but Mr. Sarkozy doesn't really bother too much about EU competition law. After all, he is French, so what? So we have a situation now that the pressure will be really on the UK government to come into the euro, and this will be a disaster for the British economy. If we cave in on this one, we really have had it, because it's the only way we have left to manage our own affairs. You can see this thread running through the whole line of EU policy. The EU car firms, Renault, Peugeot, Mercedes, Volkswagen, Fiat, they maintain a huge lobbying presence in the Brussels to ensure that Brussels regulations are very favourable to them. We of course don't, because we are Brits and we like to play by the rules. Now, the end result of this, most recently, has been the directive that says you must have your car serviced by a franchise dealer using approved and spare parts. This is wonderful for the EU car firms, because in fact major car firms make far more money out of selling spares than they ever do out of selling new cars. New cars are virtually given away, but the spares are where they make the money. So if they can jack up the amount of money they get in from spares and also from their franchises, it's wonderful for them. And who pays for it? Well, of course, the good old British consumer will pay for it, because they will no longer be able to take their car to the local garage to have it done at a cheaper labour rate, and also to have it done using what is called second source parts. Now, there's nothing wrong with second source spare parts for a car. They're actually usually made on the same production line as are made the badged parts. The only difference is that they go into a plain box, and the ones that are made for the Mercedes or Volkswagen, they go into a box with Volkswagen stamped on it, or Mercedes. And that's the only single difference. So we end up now cutting ourselves off from cheap spares, having to pay through the nose for the franchise dealers' labour rates, And who ends up making the profits? Well, it's the EU courtrooms. This I find absolutely iniquitous. It is an infringement of free trade. It causes no end of problems in an area like ours here, a country area, where to take a car to a franchise dealer, you may have you might have to travel 20 or 25 miles. And then you've got to go there to collect your car. And it's only the latest in a long line of such directives which blatantly favour continental Europe as opposed to the UK. And this is the problem we have all along with the EU. It's not that all EU regulations are bad, I wouldn't go so far as that, but it is the fact that they are designed to favour the major EU economies, which are Germany and France. Now Germany is currently very, very exercised as well because the EU wants to set up a central treasury. Why do they want to do that? Well, it's so they can issue EU bonds into the market and raise money for what is colloquially known as the PIIGS. That is Portugal, Ireland, Greece and Spain. You might ask, why can the PIIGS not raise the money themselves? Well, the answer is they are now seen as an increasingly bad credit risk. And therefore the amount that they will have to pay in interest would be probably somewhere approaching 1.5% to 2% more than the German government. And when you add that up over the funding requirement of 500 billion euro, it's a huge amount of money. Now, the Germans are not desperately happy about this because, in fact, what they see now is that these Mediterranean countries will be getting a free deal, a free ride on the back of their good credit rating. It's a bit like seeking for yourself, seeking a mortgage and say, well look, I haven't got a very big income, so will you just sign the mortgage form for me and I'll get it at a better rate and I'll get more money. And that really is what's going on. But the Germans can see that they are going to end up actually having to pay for this and to, in fact, subsidise the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Irish, the Greeks, and the Italians. It is not a happy situation. And this, I think, is our best chance of getting out of the EU, because that system is inherently unstable. I gave a talk recently at Swindon in which I compared the EU to the Roman Empire. And this is undoubtedly the model that the EU wishes to work on. It wishes to have total control over everything, and the one characteristic an empire, two characteristics an empire always has, it has to have a common language, and it has to have a common currency. Now, the problem that the EU have is that they cannot agree on a common language. The obvious choice is English, but of course the French would rather die in the ditch than have English. The French actually detest us. They call us the Anglo-Saxons, by which we group us and the Americans, and I've come to the conclusion they really cannot stand the Brits because we took Napoleon away from them, the great French hero, and banged them up on an island and left them to rot. So the French, ever since, have been intent on promoting French culture, and make no mistake, they do it very, very effectively. I have been in Sudan. I worked in Khartoum for a while, and I always remember how assiduous the French embassy was in promoting French culture to the Sudanese compared to the British embassy that really couldn't care. I was invited several times to dinner with the French culture attaché. I never got a single invite from the British embassy all the time I was there. But the French were they're very, very good at it, and they do promote their culture and their language, and they do not want to see the Anglo-Saxons, as they say, triumph. It's a very dangerous business because these people in France think they can actually compete on equal terms with the USA. The USA is a superpower. It has a dynamic economy. It has a fantastic set of universities. It has fantastic industrial potential. And what have we got in Europe? We've got a motley crew of mid-Europeans who have been fighting each other for the last 1,000 years. Now, if anybody tells you that they're all going to suddenly love each other, it doesn't bear scrutiny. If you look at what's happened in Northern Ireland and Ireland, you still see the old enmities persisting. If you look at what's happening in Croatia and Bosnia, same thing. And if you look at what's happening in Spain and Italy. So therefore, that is a major weakness in the EU project, is this lack of a common language. And I honestly don't know how they're going to get out of it other than they all sign up and decide they're going to do Esperanto or something else. The second weakness, of course, is the lack of a common currency. Now, a currency union is a very difficult thing to pull off. It's been tried on numerous occasions in the past, and it only actually works when it is backed up by a total political union. And that is why the Lisbon Treaty was so important and so crucial for the EU, and why they put in such amount of effort to get it through. Because that essentially is a self-amending treaty and essentially turns the EU into a sovereign state, which will be able to issue its own bonds, which will be able to have its own taxation, and which in fact will become then a sovereign country. This is highly dangerous for us, because quite soon they are going to come into conflict with the Americans, and there'll only be one winner in that conflict, and it's not going to be the Europeans. That's quite clear. The amount of energy they devote now to actually reproducing work that the Americans have done is incredible. They are building a satellite system which the Americans have. They have a perfectly good satellite system. The Europeans can use it anytime they want. But no, they want to have, quotes, a European solution for European problems. Well, it's not actually a European problem, it's a worldwide problem, having a satellite navigation system, because we sail around the world and we fly around the world. But anyway, that doesn't stop our friends. And this is the thing that really concerns me most of all, that we are going to get eventually involved in a clash with the Americans in, it may be come in the Middle East, it may be come in Africa, where we are competing for resources with the Americans. And this is really dangerous stuff, because you can see now the push for a European army, the push for a European navy, and these guys are going to try and take on the Americans militarily, eventually. They think of Napoleon, they think of Bismarck, the great leaders, but they don't realise Napoleon did most of his fighting around the turn of the 18th century, and Bismarck did most of his round about the end part, in the mid to late part of the 19th century. And things have moved on considerably since then. The centres of power are no longer in Europe, they're in the US and the Far East with China. And that really petrifies me, because I go round now, the villages round here in Somerset, and in every village you can see a monument to what being in the heart of Europe has meant for this country. And it's the names on the war memorial of the sons of that village who were killed mainly, or should I say slaughtered, in the First World War, in a continental war that was none of our business, frankly. And I look at how many brothers my grandparents lost, and I think I'd never ever want that to happen again. And I am petrified now that if we are in the EU, that is what will happen. We will see our sons and daughters sent to die for something that is of no concern to us whatsoever, and does not impinge on our way of life. And that is why I would oppose us being in the EU, and I think we could do better if we were out of the EU. Cut it there, and I'll talk some more if you want me to. I've been asked to say a little bit about what happened in roughly the period 72-73, when I was in the civil service and Mr. Heath was negotiating entry, and his chief negotiator was Geoffrey Rippon. Well, I worked with a number of ministers, and I think without exception they had all served in the Second World War. One of the ministers I did work with had an outstanding war record. He'd been parachuted behind enemy lines into what is called the Balkans, and he had survived for I think about 2.5 years. And that was in an area where if the Germans had caught him, he'd have been tortured and shot. But this formed the views of many of the people who were in the positions of power in government. Heath had been in the army as well, as had Enoch Powell, and a number of others. And the overwhelming reason for going in to the EU, or the common market as it was to avoid another European war, another European conflict situation. The argument was that if we were all in bed together and we were all interdependent, then of course we would be able, we wouldn't want to fight each other. And that was actually a very laudable ambition. But it was never presented as that. It was presented as something which was of great benefit to the UK economy. Now, this was actually a very dubious argument, because I saw some of the papers that came across my desk, and the benefits to the UK from going into Europe were marginal, to say the least. There was a considerable political dimension to it, because at that stage he was having trouble with the miners, and eventually the miners brought about his downfall when he foolishly took them on the wrong issue. But the feeling was, if we joined the EU, or the common market as it then was, we would end up with a more dynamic economy, and we'd get rid of all these troublesome unions. And that was the second thread of the agenda. So this was then presented to the British people as being a wonderful economic opportunity. And Heath went on TV and said, as soon as we were in the common market, there would be industrialists rushing to invest in the UK. Well, I remember writing something pointing out that actually we were a small island at that stage with a population of roughly 50 million. On the continent, you had a population of 200 million. If you're an industrialist looking at where you're going to locate your major plants, where are you going to put them? You're not going to put them where the little island is, with 20% of the population. You're going to put them closer to the centre of your population. And that is what inevitably will happen, and we will end up with basically what I would call a warehouse economy, with most of the manufacturing done on the continent of Europe. Now, I know that the Japanese have rushed to invest in the UK, but that was really because the UK welcomed the Japanese, and the French and the Germans were absolutely petrified and did not encourage Japanese companies at the start to invest in their own continental land. Now it's changed. We've seen how successful the Japanese are, and you do have Toyota plants in France, for instance, and things like that. But at the start, they didn't encourage the Japanese. So that was one good thing we did get out of it, in the sense that it came from the Japanese. Now, going back to Mr. Heath and his activities. So then we had the actual vote. Now, I have the vote. I don't have the voting list to hand, but I seem to recollect it went through on a majority of about 8 votes. Heath did not have a majority in the Conservative Party for it. It was billed as a free vote. It depended on the support of various Labour people like Shirley Williams and Roy Jenkins, and what were then called the Liberals in those days, people like Joe Grimmond. And it was nothing like a free vote. It was actually a very, very heavily whipped vote, and the people were intimidated, they were threatened with what would happen to them, and you have to cast your mind back into the 70s, and actually being a homosexual was a cause of death in politicians in the 70s, and the whips in both sides ruthlessly exploited this, and the vote went through. I would stand correction on this, but it was a majority of about 8, and it went through not on Conservative votes, but on the votes of Labour rebels. Harold Wilson, to avoid splitting the Labour Party, gave the Labour Party a free vote, and it was genuinely a free vote. The Tories didn't have a free vote on it. They were intimidated and cowed, and some of them who stood up to it did actually vote against it. But that was how it was got through. Now, it was also a false bill in the sense that this was never the intention of the French and the Germans to have a loose confederation of independent sovereign states which would cooperate for the benefit of their people. The French and the Germans wanted to reinvent, you could call it the Holy Roman Empire, of Charlemagne. They wanted control. And this was always their agenda, and everything was aimed at breaking down the sovereign states' power, breaking down the boundaries between sovereign states, breaking down the loyalties to sovereign states, and building up the supranational element. Now there's a big difference between supranationalism, which is dictated from the centre, which is what the French and Germans like. Now this, in fact, is quite common in French and German culture. If you look at the Code Napoleon, it's very much a centralist code. If you look at how Bismarck set up Germany, very, very much it's a centralist, militaristic code. Habeas corpus doesn't exist on the continent. And these factors, however, were not put to the British people. And as soon as of course, the government pushed us through into the common market, and we had to put up with the sale of our wholesale takeover of our fishing grounds, and as Heath described it, he said it was a price worth paying. Well, it may have been a price worth paying for Mr. Heath, because the fishermen didn't have any votes in Bexley Heath, which was his constituency. But for some of my relatives along the east coast of Scotland, it was a disaster. It was a disaster in Cornwall as well, the fishing industry. It was a disaster on the east coast of England, East Anglia, Yarmouth. Complete and utter cynical giveaway of our fishing industry, which we will not get back and have suffered from ever since. But this was pure cynical political calculation. There were no votes in it for Mr. Heath, and therefore Mr. Heath really didn't care. Now since then, things have gone on, and gradually the supranational agenda has emerged. It was always there. I saw papers dating back to actually the first attempt to get into the common market, which was Macmillan in 1957, where it was quite clearly laid out to ministers that actually there was a supranational agenda. If we went in, we would be giving away our sovereignty, and we would end up being no more than a vassal state of a huge new empire. This, of course, was never put to the British people in any way or shape or form whatsoever. So it was really a rigged election. Then afterwards, of course, Mr. Wilson had promised that there would be a referendum on whether we should stay in the common market or get out when he came to power. And duly, he did have his referendum. Well, of course, things were slightly different then, because by the time in 1975 that referendum came round, we had lost all our Commonwealth trading partners. The price of food had rocketed in this country by, I think, roughly 30 to 40%. The Commonwealth had been totally alienated, and there was a very, very rigged poll organised where the massive amount of money was spent on publicity for a yes vote and virtually nothing on publicity for a no vote. And not surprisingly, the vote came in as yes, we would want to stay in the common market. And that is the only time it's ever been put to the British people, and it was put in a very biased way and under very biased circumstances, simply to avoid a split in the Labour Party. It was all done for the crudest political, cynical manipulation reasons. And since then, things have gone on from bad to worse, in my opinion. But you do have to recognise that the people who have pushed through successive bills integrating us further and further into Europe have largely been the Tory governments, because they have been in power. Mrs. Thatcher, Mr. Major, Amsterdam, Maastricht, the Single Market Treaty. And so when Conservatives tell you that they're really Eurosceptics, you have to look at who put through the bills that took us into Europe, that got us deeper and deeper into Europe. And the answer is, out of the 5 or 6 bills, I think 4 or 5 have been pushed through by the Tories. Only one, the Lisbon Treaty Bill, has gone through under Labour. So that's the answer I always give to Tories who say, well, I'm really a Eurosceptic, I'm really with you. They are actually only after your vote. They do not want to get out of Europe. They have voted consistently to be in Europe, and they will continue to do that. There are few of them notable exceptions, people like Bill Cash, honourable men who genuinely do not want to be in Europe, that the majority, I'm afraid, do. So that is what my message would be. If anybody says, I'm a Tory and I'm a eurosceptic, vote for me, believe it. Right, I've been asked to say a few words about the banking system as I worked in the Bank of England. Well, my former employees, I'm afraid, are very culpable in this, despite the attempts to pretend they're not so. And the basic reason is there is only one place in the UK that actually manufactures money, and that is called the Bank of England. And the root cause of the massive bubble in property and credit was the fact that they pumped out too much money into the markets at too cheap a price. And this has been going on virtually since the year 2000. Up to 2000 there was a slight break because there was this problem called the Y2K bug, and nobody really knew what was going to happen in the year 2000. There were all sorts of stories around it. It was virtually Armageddon. Computer systems would collapse. I always argued, and I was quite glad to be proved right, that nothing would happen, which is indeed just what it was. I can't think of a single computer system that fell over on 31st of December 1999. It just did not happen. So that acted as a bit of a restraint. Now once it got past that, and remember Tony's government was elected in 1997, the brakes were off. There was a huge pressure on the bank to actually support government policy. Now the Bank of England is not independent. It's claimed to be independent, but if you look at who appoints the governor, who appoints the two deputy governors, well, that is actually the Chancellor of the Exchequer, or the Prime Minister, essentially. There are 4 outside members of the MPC, and who appoints them? Well, that's the Prime Minister, or the Bank altogether. Does anybody vet them? Well, yes, John McFall's Treasury Select Committee had a go at vetting a couple of them. They said they didn't like one man. In fact, he had been the editor, Richard Lambert, the editor of the Financial Times, and they weren't very keen on Mr. Lambert because he didn't have any economic qualifications. And when they raised this, Brown just waved 2 fingers at him and said, "I'm sorry, he's my nominee." That's it. End of story. And then, who else is on the MPC? There's 2 other members. There's a chap I was happy to see appointed today, Paul Fisher, whom I worked with at the bank, and I like Paul very much. And another guy called Spencer Dale, whom I knew of, and I never worked with Spencer. And they are what's called executive directors. They sit on the MPC, but even so, although their appointment is made by the governor, their appointments have to be approved by the Treasury, HMT. Gus O'Donnell in my day did it. So you have a system that it's not really a central bank. And the way the political control is exerted is very insidious, and unless you're an insider you don't really realise it's going on. Mervyn King wanted to be governor. Eddie George was coming to the end of his 2nd term, and I'd have to think exactly when that was. It was about 2001, 2002. Therefore, Mervyn King, who was running the inflation report, did not want to upset the Labour government, and he made sure they didn't. And they got cheap money. Interest rates were kept down, and duly Mervyn was rewarded by being made governor of the bank. Now that was great. And then things went on as before, but a governor is appointed for a 5-year term, which in my opinion is actually a mistake. We should only have a single term of 7 years, I think, and not be subject to reappointment, but because reappointment is like the re-election of an American president, it creates instability. And the instability was created at the same time in 2007 when Northern Rock hit the buffers. Now, actually, Gordon Brown could have confirmed Mervyn King for a 2nd term in 2006, late 2006. He didn't do it. And he didn't do it because he was unhappy with Mervyn King. And the reason he was unhappy with Mervyn King is a very outstanding and very clever academic economist, but he's not a banker. He doesn't actually like talking to bankers. And this is a severe handicap, actually, and being governor of the Bank of England, because you tend to have to deal with bankers quite a lot. As opposed to the ECB, where the ECB have a man called Trichet, who actually was charged with criminal fraud in France, but of course is a career banker and does understand banking. However, come the Northern Rock fiasco, which hit the buffers in, I think, August 2007, Gordon was in a very difficult position. He didn't want Mervyn King, but then it would look awful if, in the middle of what he thought was a major crisis, Northern Rock, which turns out to be a real pimple now compared to what we've got, he didn't want to be seen rocking the boat and saying that I will have a new governor of the Bank of England. So for short-term political reasons again, and this is the thread that runs through all my thoughts, in banking decisions have been made persistently for short-term political gain. Gordon decided he would reappoint Mervyn. Then when things really started to go bad and Lehman's went down the tube, Royal Bank of Scotland got into trouble, HBOS got into trouble, quite suddenly Mervyn was left looking very, very exposed as a man who knew the theory but didn't have the practical. He hadn't sat on the trading desk ever and spoken to these guys. He didn't understand how these guys thought. So hence now we have got into a big, big mess with the Bank of England. And to be fair, you have to be fair, you have to be absolutely objective when you're working in a finance faculty. The ECB, with Trichet, an alleged criminal found not guilty, handled the thing far, far better than the Bank of England did, with less political interference. Although there was attempts from Sarkozy, but the ECB was set up at the behest of the Germans in a very, very rigorous manner. Now, the reason the Germans set it up in such a rigorous manner to prevent political interference was that they had lived through 2 episodes of hyperinflation, when the money just got wiped out. At the end of the Weimar Republic in 1929, just before Hitler came to power, and at the end of the Second World War, just after they lost. And I always remember my mother's great friend was an Austrian nurse nursing in Stuttgart at the time, and she said at the end of the war she took her entire savings out of the bank and she went down and she bought a portable radio. And she said that morning, she left it for the afternoon, she wouldn't be able to afford that because the prices were going up hugely. Now that scarred the Germans for life, and it's still a big thing in the German psyche, and they will not allow massive erosion of their currency again, and the ECB is designed not to. Now, you may have read in the papers that the Bank of England is indulging in something called quantitative easing. Quantitative easing is a wonderful phrase. It sounds like something very, very obscure and high-powered. In fact, it's nothing more than printing money. Basically, all that happens is Mervyn King goes down, if you like, to the basement of the Bank of England, cranks up the printing press, and there you are. We knock off another 20 billion or 30 billion of £20 notes, and that's it, and you push them out, which is great. Now that is what the ECB will not allow, because they have seen the effects of that. And that is a weakness in the Bank of England's policy. It works in the short term, but it's a bit like drugs. You have to keep injecting the drug again and again and again, and eventually you end up in the situation that Mr. Mugabe's in Zimbabwe with hyperinflation. So I'm very, very pessimistic about what's happening, because these people in the Bank of England just now are saying, don't worry, we can control this. I am not so sure they can. If they are able to control it, they'll be the first time a central bank has managed to control this. And that is why I have admiration, actually, for the ECB, in that they have resisted this siren call to print money, and they have resisted the siren call to reduce interest rates to 0. And in fact, I think, as a central bank operation, they are in a much better shape than we are. And the reason is, of course, they have set up to be much more resistant to political control. One thing I would say is the assumption is always made by the Europhiles. If we want to join the Euro, they'll just say, wonderful, come in, here, we'll have you, great. That's not the case. To join the Euro requires that you pass certain criteria. And one of these criteria is that the central bank, i.e. Mr. Trichet, must be satisfied about the independence of the central bank. It is a requirement of the Maastricht Treaty, Article 105, that to enter the euro you must have an independent central bank. But when the Hungarians wanted in, the ECB looked at the structure of their central bank and said, I'm sorry, your bank isn't independent enough, you'll have to go away and think again. And their governor, they changed the governor's term to a 7-year single term. For that reason, I think it had been 4 years renewable before that. And that, I think, is what will happen to us. If we ever apply to join the euro, it is not going to be a straightforward process. And what it will entail is actually real giving up of political power over the Bank of England. And that is what the governments of this country, in particular Gordon Brown, will never agree to. When I worked in the bank, although the MPC is nominally independent, there is a Treasury representative on that committee. He is non-voting, but he sits there and he listens to everything he's said, and he takes notes. He notes who said what, and he reports back to the Chancellor, who in those days was Gordon Brown. Now that man, in my day, and I used to talk to him sometimes after coffee, was a chap called Gus O'Donnell. He's now Sir Gus O'Donnell. He's the Cabinet Secretary and the head of the Home Civil Service. So he is a man who really was on the inside, and that shows you the extent of the political control of the Bank of England. They put in there the guy who was going to be the next head of the Civil Service and Cabinet Secretary, just to watch what that committee was doing. So we have a situation in the UK where we have, again, this story is spun that we have an independent central bank, but it's not. Unfortunately, when they come to deal with the ECB, which is modelled on the old Bundesbank, they're going to have to face up to the fact that the ECB and the old Bundesbank really was independent. If you remember, when we got kicked out of the ERM and Mr. Norman Lamont went, and John Major, they went to the German Chancellor and said, could you back our currency? Could you use your gold reserves to stop us being dropped out of the ERM? And the German Chancellor replied to him, I'm sorry, it is not my decision to make. It is a decision for the governor of the Bundesbank. Now, it was written up in the paper that this was not true. It is true, actually. The German Chancellor speaking nothing but the plain, unvarnished truth. The decision to whether to deploy reserves, countries with the German reserves to support sterling, was the decision of the governor of the Bundesbank, and he refused. And I think he was probably quite right to refuse. So you do have this problem, you see, because in the UK, the gold and currency reserves of the country are not controlled by the Bank of England. The Bank of England stores them, the Bank of England manages them. The Bank of England does not own them, it carries them on, it doesn't carry them on the balance sheet, it acts only as an agent. The ownership is vested in the Treasury, Gordon Brown, as was. So therefore, when Gordon decided to sell the gold at a very knockdown price, the Bank of England had no say in it. Eddie George, who was governor, advised against it, but Gordon was determined, so it went like that. And that is a difference between our central bank and the other central banks in the world. Where, in fact, the German reserves are carried on the books of the Bundesbank, the French reserves are carried on the books of the Banque de France, as are the Italian reserves for what they are, and therefore it is up to the governor of these banks what to deploy this. The ECB actually does not have that great an amount of currency reserves. It has roughly 10% of the EU area, and this again is what Tim Condon likes to call the lacuna at the hole, at the heart of the euro, because if they ever had to use the reserves to support their currency, they would have to go cap in hand to the governor of the Bundesbank, Banque de France, Banca d'Italia, Banca d'Espagna, and ask them to use their reserves to support it, because they don't have the control over reserves, and that is because people like countries like France and Germany realise how important these reserves are, and they don't want to give away that control. They have it on the bank, on their central bank books, but that's on the national central bank. So that is another huge difference that we have, and the end result is that we are going to get into trouble on this quantitative easing, printing of money, and I do worry what will happen. Thank you. I've been asked to talk about the PIIGS, that is Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece and Spain, and their bonds. Now, the creditworthiness of a bond is measured in two ways, which are correlated. You have what is called the rating, which is produced by one of these bond agencies, and the highest rating is AAA, and the lowest investment grade rating is BBB. It goes down from AAA to AA, single A. Now, the problem is, as your rating drops, then the interest rate you will be charged if you want people, or you will have to pay if you want people to buy your worthless bits of paper, which is all a bond is. It's just an IOU. It's nothing fancy. It's just, that's all it is. Actually goes up. So, for instance, Germany, which is AAA, pays the lowest rate. UK, which is AAA, but is not perceived by the market as a good credit risk as Germany, has to pay roughly 0.4%. It varies, but 0.4% currently over the German rate. The Germans pay. The French pay roughly what we do, slightly more, possibly about 0.5. But when you come to the PIIGS, the Greeks were paying recently something like 2.5% over the German rate, and that's a huge amount. If you think of a mortgage, it's like going for a mortgage and you say, well, I want to borrow money to buy my house, and the building society is fine, you get, we'll charge you 4.5% or 4%. And then somebody else goes and they look at you and say, oh, well, I'm sorry, Mr. Pig, but you're a bad credit risk, we'll have to charge you 6.5%. Now that makes a hell of a difference for your mortgage. You know, you're paying an awful lot more over 25 years. Now, it is getting very, very tight in what is called the credit market just now. And in fact, the Greeks, normally countries finance at 10 years. So that is, they will issue a 10-year bond and investment banks will buy it. But the Greeks were obviously, their investment bank advised them, who was handling the issue, that they would not get away a 10-year bond at anything like a decent rate of interest. And the advice was therefore they would have to fund at what's called the short end. So they funded on 3 months' money, which means they have to come back to the market in 3 months' time to refinance. And therefore, there is going to be this recurrent problem. It's going to come back again and again and again, because you can only work this trick so often, and gradually the market realises, hey, you know, these guys are not credit risks, good credit risks, we're not buying their stuff. Or they put in, the way the bids are doing, they put in more and more bids, and the interest rate paid goes up and up and up. So therefore, you have this huge problem. Now, it particularly affects the PIIGS. It particularly affects these countries which have what is called a large government deficit. That is, government expenditure massively exceeds their income from tax and things. And by massively, we're talking about something between 10 and 15%. That's a lot to be over. And also, some of these countries have got quite high existing debts as well, and that makes it even more difficult to get bonds away. You must remember that you have to have someone who's prepared to buy your bond, who's prepared to take the IOU off your hands and say, here you are, yes, I'll give you whatever it is, at that rate of interest, 5.5%, 6%, whatever it is. And this is becoming steadily more difficult for the PIIGS. And there's always going to be a market for these, because the ECB will take these bonds as what is called collateral in their repo operations. Repo stands for repurchase operations, which is the way you finance it. It basically means we, the ECB, will lend you £1 billion for 3 months or 1 month or whatever it is, 1 month usually. You will give us bonds to the value of slightly more than £1 billion, so that if anything happens, we can actually sell the bond and we'll get our money back if you default. It's just like giving your house deeds to the building society if you default, except, of course, whether the building society in the present circumstances will be able to get your value back. It's not, and it's the same thing in the bond market. It is not clear that actually, if you had to sell these bonds, you would actually get your money back. So for that reason, there's various little tricks. The ECB will demand what's called variation margin. So if a bond price falls in the period of the loan, they will say, hold on, this is not covering us, we have to have some more collateral, you have to give us some more bonds and things like that go on. But therefore you do have this problem on refinancing. But is that captive market always there? Because if you're buying a bond which yields, shall we say, a German bond for 4%, it would cost you roughly, shall we say, £100 for that bond. But if you're buying a nominal bond from the Greeks, you would probably be only paying £60 or so for it. It's only worth £60, and the interest rate on it would be 2 or 3% more than it is on a German bond. Now, that's fine, but the problem is the market price is much more volatile on Greek bonds than it is on German bonds. And for that reason, the only people who will take PIIGS bonds tend to be central banks, and in fact also national banks operating in these countries, because the government has control over the national bank, so it can say to the national bank, you must take our bonds. But in the international market, most of the investment banks, the American investment banks, won't touch these bonds. Now, when I was with the Bank of England, it was decided for us, shall we say, that we would take Italian government bonds. And I was charged with figuring out how we would take these damn things. And I think I did. I was never ever allowed to forget it by the investment bankers of JP Morgan, Goldman's. And they said, why on earth, Eric, are you taking this stuff? We don't touch it, you know. I said, I know you don't touch it, but we have a political master who says, thou shalt take it. So we take it as well, and it is desperately, desperately worrying, because in fact you have huge risks of defaults in these countries. Italians have a long record of defaulting on their bonds. They just say, sorry, we're not paying you. The Greeks have a long record of defaulting on their bonds. The Spanish have a long record of defaulting on their bonds. People think now that this is the worst economic crisis that we have faced. What we do not realise is actually how close the system came to meltdown in 1997, when the Russians defaulted on their bonds. Russia is a huge country, and it just turned around and said, sorry, we can't pay our interest. We are freezing interest payments, we are freezing capital payments, not only on their sovereign bonds, but on their commercial bonds. And that happened in August 97. It virtually, the whole credit bond system almost blew up at that stage. It almost went into complete meltdown. There was a company, we've heard about investment banks, but at that stage, there were hedge funds. And the biggest hedge fund was something called long-term capital management. And long-term capital management was run by a guy called John Merriweather. At one stage, long-term capital management was running positions in British gilts, which were roughly, it was about 800 billion. That exceeded the total amount of British gilts that were issued by the British government. It was huge. And the whole thing almost went into complete meltdown. It was bailed out actually by these much maligned investment bankers organised by the Fed. The Fed got them together, banged a few heads together and said, you will bail out these guys. And they did. Nobody heard about it. It was done behind closed doors, and it worked. The actual long-term capital management positions were unwound over a period of about 5 years. And actually nobody lost money on them. They were good, solid investments. The problem we've had, if you go back to Northern Rock, was this silly man Vince Cable banging on about taxpayers' money. Actually, there weren't any taxpayers' money went into Northern Rock, and banging on about the taxpayer must be protected. And then Alistair Darling introduced this wonderful thing that we would get the money back in as quickly as possible. Can't be done. In banking crises, you must actually allow time to liquidate your assets. If you liquidate them in a rush, you get a very poor price. You have to liquidate them over a long period of time, and long-term capital management assets were liquidated over 5 years. Now, of course, they've just realised they've got it wrong with Northern Rock, and they've now said Northern Rock is okay, you don't have to pay us back in 2 years' time, you have 5 years to pay us. Because what we did generate was a problem, but of course the easy way is just to say to people who are renewing their mortgage, well, we'll renew your mortgage, but it'll cost you 7.5%, and they'll say, but I can go down to the Alliance in Leicester and get one for 6%. I'm going off to the Alliance in Leicester, and they say, Mr. Northern Rock says, that's fine, you go. Well, that's great. Mr. Northern Rock gets his money back, but puts more strain on Alliance in Leicester, and that's where the instability built up in the system for that very reason. Now, you may think I'm joking when I say that actually it can take virtually a lifetime to run off problem banks. You can probably remember what was called the secondary banking crisis, which came about in 1973, and it was people who were associated with things like Jim Slater and his banks. The Bank of England bailed them out. I left the Bank of England in 2002, 2003. At that stage, we still had on the Bank of England books 2 of these secondary banks that we bailed out 30 years ago, because it just takes that length of time to resolve a banking crisis. It is not within the horizon of a government or a succession of governments, and this is why we're in the mess now. We've been trying to get money back too quickly without realising it just can't be done. Thank you.